Welcome to the Denoise Podcast. Our goal is to bring clarity to the noisy discourse surrounding computer graphics and its premier open source software, Blender. In this episode, we're talking about why Blender's free, what you can and can't do with it thanks to its open source license, and how we think about the controversial gray area that some add-ons exist in. My name is Jonathan Lampel, and I've been teaching at cgcookie.com, the site that's all about learning Blender, for about 8 years. I'm also the product manager for a newer company called Orange Turbine, which builds tools and services for businesses who use Blender. Joining me today is Jason van Gumster, who leads the consulting efforts at Orange Turbine, is well known in the Blender community as the author of Blender for Dummies, as a legendary forum moderator called Fweeb, as a big open source advocate, and as the person with the most epic sideburns at any conference. We also have Jonathan Williamson, who's a co-founder of CG Cookie, the Blender Market, and Orange Turbine. He's made some of the most iconic Blender tutorials since before YouTube even existed, and dreamed up RetopoFlow, the first commercially successful Blender add-on. So it's an understatement to say that today's topic is important to us, because not only are we passionate about Blender, how we're allowed to use it directly impacts our livelihood. Of course, we have some thoughts. Keep in mind, though, that we're tech artists and not lawyers, so nothing in this show should be considered legal advice. With that said, let's get into it. One thing that I didn't know when I first started using Blender was that it wasn't always free. I thought it kind of had always been that way. And I didn't know the full story, and that's pretty interesting. Jason, you said you were able to look that up a little bit beforehand, and obviously you've known about that for forever.
I'm going to be dating myself. This is going to be fantastic. I started using Blender in 1998. I heard about it in 97. I started really playing with it more in 1998. This was, I think, Blender 1 point something. But this is when the manual was actually this really cool design thing, spiral bound. And Blender was originally an in-house tool for a Dutch production company called Neo Geo, which has no relation whatsoever to the SNK video game system of the day. And so they were using it for television production, commercials, those sort of things. And they built it in-house because they couldn't afford the massive SGI tools and Maya and those sort of things. And so it was used for that, but at the same time it was being released. It had a free version. You know, at that point in time, shareware was really the more like the that was the way software was released. If you're going indie, but that was this basic shareware model. And at that point in time, Blender had what we called a C key and B key, and you would spend, I think it was like $100 to get full access to all of the features that Blender has. Otherwise, you just have the basic version that comes with that. And that model got a lot of people interested because it was still, even at $100, it was quite a bit cheaper than anything else that was out there, which was, we're talking 5-digit numbers in terms of dollars. And so it got a lot of interest and a lot of excitement about it. And so Neo Geo spun that out to its own company, Not a Number, that would continue to develop Blender and make it as an actual property. And you showed it at SIGGRAPH, got a lot of acclaim for it and a lot of interest in it. But this was also around the same time as it was like 2000-ish. That's the dot bomb excitement where everything, the dot bomb. They had all the, all this investment money going into places, and then all of a sudden everything dried up and things started shutting down. And Not a Number was one of those things. But by that point in time, I think they estimated that Blender had probably 250,000 users, which in the grand scheme of things, not a whole lot of users, but there was enough people behind it. And so Ton went to the holding company that had all the Blender IP and basically struck a deal with them. Said, look, if we can raise 100,000 euro, then we'll release it under an open source license. GPL was the one that they picked, and it'll be managed and owned by the community at that point. And this is also very notable in sort of internet history. This is one of the first examples of crowdsourcing. This was before things like Kickstarter or Patreon or any of that stuff existed at all. So this was all home rolled. And then Blender was also one of the first applications that was, we will say, liberated by its community. As a Blender community, we bought it. And so when people ask how, you see this sort of weird passion behind people who use Blender and this weird sense of ownership. It's not just the open source thing is a continuation of this, but it all started by, we bought it. It's ours. That's it. And the expectation was it would take, to raise 100,000 euro, the expectation it would take 6 months to a year to do that. The community raised that money in 7 weeks.
Has that ever happened again? Like, I mean, obviously there's lots of proprietary software that has then been released as open source later on. The project gets abandoned, the original creators are no longer interested, whatever it is. But is there any other scenario or instance of the community actually coming together to purchase the rights to release as open source?
I'm sure there is. None of them actually jump to mind. And I think it is fair to mention that the community did come together behind this, but the whole campaign, the whole idea, the whole thing would never have happened without somebody like Ton sort of making it happen. From that point forward, Blender was released under the GPL. We finally got undo. It was one of the first features that was added to Blender because it didn't have it at the time. And the rest is I guess the rest is history still in the making.
How much did that change pre-open source versus after open source? Were the same people still working on it, or?
A lot of them are still active in the Blender community, doing things that are, some of them are Blender adjacent, some of them are directly with Blender, some of them not at all associated with it. People who started trying to use it to do things, and people were interested in not just using it, but also developing for it because it was released under an open source license. It's this software that can do, stuff that, especially at the time was, $10,000+ to get in the door and even play with it was available. I would say the vast majority, even now, of Blender's developers actually started as artists that wanted Blender to do something, and it didn't. And so they took advantage of the fact that it's open source and started monkeying around with the code and making it happen. And then, one thing leads to another, and all of a sudden, oh man, I'm a developer now.
I think just about everybody that I know within the, active Blender development team started that way. I'm sure that there's some counterexamples, but the vast majority of them, even that are still involved to this day on a regular basis, be it, on their own time or actually paid by the foundation, almost every single one of them started as artists.
One thing that I thought was interesting when it comes to the developers was that some of them started specifically because of the open source license and said that they wouldn't have contributed if it wasn't GPL specific. So we'll talk a lot about the GPL, of course, here, but even before that, what is open source in general?
Without getting into the fantastic infighting of open source versus free software and all of that stuff, the simple version of it is software that you don't just get the actual application that does the thing. You get the source code to it, and you have the right to change it and share it with anybody you want, however you want. And specifically with the GPL, you know that any changes that you make, someone else can make changes to, and they also have to share the changes that they made.
And their ability to make changes that you may not even like is the same right that protects your ability to make your own changes.
It makes the assumption that as a user of software, you also have the potential to be a developer.
Right. That's exactly it.
It seems a little, counterintuitive at first, because, so many people have this attachment to the things that they make, and they say, no, I own this thing. Well, open source is kind of saying, no, we all own it.
In that case, who decides what actually gets in the software?
Different open source projects use different models, and this is where you hear people talk about governance of who decides what goes in and what happens. And the two most common models, and you can actually compare Blender and we'll say GIMP, actually. Blender, you have what's referred to as the benevolent dictator for life, which is Ton, right? He has the final yay or nay as to whether or not something happens. And as the years have gone by, he has said yay or nay much less, and that's gone more towards the community. Whereas with GIMP development, there's not a central figurehead. They have to arrive at a consensus as to what's going to go in. There's still a central repository, there's still a central place where it happens, but then you have to communicate with people. And that's how that works. It's really dictated by whatever your agreed upon governance structure is.
Well, it's also worth noting that at the end of the day, anybody can choose what goes into Blender, but you may not get your version distributed, through official channels. If you want something included in the default version of Blender that is distributed through blender.org, which is maintained and run by the Blender Foundation, you've got to work within that governance. If you want to just create your own version of Blender to do whatever you want to do and release it on your own site, cool, go for it. Nobody else needs to you don't need buy-in from anybody else to do that.
And there are plenty of valid forks out there.
So there's a lot of different types of open source licenses. What makes the GPL unique?
all software licenses, in case you're not aware, all software licenses are copyright licenses. They're all based in copyright law. The most common version of that is all rights reserved, right? You don't get to copy it or change it or sell it or redistribute it unless you have clearance from me specifically saying you can do that. That's the all rights reserved license. You do nothing unless I say so. That's the license. You have the permission to use it under these conditions. Well, what the GPL does is says, well, the condition is you can have it, you can use it, and you can change it. But if you change it and share it, you have to share it with everyone. That's really what makes it unique versus another license like the MIT or BSD license, which is also an open source license, which basically says you can use it, but I don't have to share the source code for it. So, for instance, people will ask, well, why didn't Blender use one of these more permissive licenses like BSD or MIT or something like that? But they could legally take Blender source code, pull it into their application. Whatever's special about Blender automatically ends up in their program, and there's no legal recourse, there's no credit, and no code goes back to the Blender project. That was a very real concern and a very real thing that the GPL protects against.
It seems to me that the beauty of the GPL, over the years, even knowing how restrictive it can be, is that it ensures the perpetuity of Blender being open. And anything else licensed as it ensures the perpetuity of it being open and free for anyone and everyone to use. The MIT license and others don't do that, right?
The GPL likes to qualify itself as free software, as in free as in speech software, not necessarily free as in money software. You can sell whatever you want. The MIT license falls into the realm of open source, which means that the source is open and you can do anything you want with it once you receive it, and you don't have any of these other requirements for it. So it's open until it's not.
The door starts open, but you can close it as you drive away.
The complication starts to happen with the restrictions of what they refer to as the viral nature of the GPL.
When software starts to interface with another software.
Exactly. And so this is the primary reason why, for instance, Blender can't use the Autodesk FBX SDK. Blender developers had to roll their own way of importing and exporting FBX files. The GPL will not allow Blender to link to closed source license without it also becoming open source. A lot of artists will complain about that because what it comes down to is I can't use this for technical reasons.
Blender is pretty fundamentally different than other free apps that you can download and use for free, like Unity or Unreal. Blender is its own monster in that the way that it's free is just wildly different.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, in the Unreal thing, people will say that Unreal is open source because you actually have access to the Unreal source, but it's not open source. It's available source.
You are given permission to use it, to modify it, to implement it, etc., with some very strong conditions that says you will abide by our licensing and our royalties and things like that. You have to work within the system that they structure for it. It seems like a long time ago, but the reality is, for the first 10 years of my career in Blender, there were no free game engines. Like, you had to purchase a copy of them other than the free demo that you could get to kind of try the waters. And, licensing at that point was dramatically more challenging.
At that point, you wouldn't get access to the source. You could write code to use their black box library. They've realized the value of having access to the source, that people can do some really cool stuff. They're trying to have their cake and eat it too.
I would conjecture that has come about because of the growth of open source software and how successful it's been, particularly a lot of those larger software houses, be it Unreal, be it Unity, you name it, recognizing that if we allow people to do more cool things with fewer restrictions, it's going to advance the software and it's going to advance the community far faster.
It's less so now than it has ever been, but there's this sort of misconception that it's the technology that's the differentiator between what makes a successful product, right? A successful game, a successful movie or whatever. That's whatever the technology behind it is the thing that made that special. When what it comes down to is that it's the people, right? It's the actual artists who are actually using those tools. The value of your IP is important because it's measurable. And it's easily sort of contained in a box, and therefore it's very easy to put down from an accounting standpoint, this has this value. Much harder to do that with the things where the actual value comes from, which is the people you've put on your team.
I would assume that either most people listening or most people who are interested in Blender are coming at it from the art standpoint and are just trying to make something. What difference does the GPL make to them versus just using some other software that happens to be free as well?
I mean, I think that, there's probably a million different ways to answer this question, but I'll answer it by bringing up an example of something that has come up over and over and over through the years. Jason, I know you are no stranger to this example, and that is, so often somebody gets really enthusiastic about Blender. They're starting to learn about it. They're discovering that it's open source, and then the fear sets in, and they go, "What if Autodesk buys Blender? How do we protect this? What do we do?" And the fact that it's free and available for anybody, people are saying, "Oh, well, Autodesk can just come in and buy this software, or Adobe can come in and buy this software." And the very nature of it being open source is what ensures that no, and as a matter of fact, they cannot. It being open source is what protects your ability as the artist to always get to use this thing, to always have access to the tools that you're using to create your art. And no matter what anybody else says or does, be it Autodesk, be it Adobe, be it Joe Schmo over here or Jason over here, doesn't matter. They have no say. They cannot dictate the terms of your ability to use the tool. Yes, they can, of course, adapt it into other things, and they can take advantage of the open source license to make more things with it, but your ability to use it is protected by the fact that it's open source, with one caveat, which is that it doesn't matter if it's open source if it stops being built. But that's where the critical mass of the community and people developing it is so valuable. And frankly, it's better off than it has ever been. I mean, I know that when Jason started in Blender and when I started in 2003, like the future of Blender was not that secure at that point in time. I mean, it was pretty secure. Like there was a ton of people using it and building it, and there was momentum that's hard to stop at that point, but it was leaps and bounds behind where it is today. Today, even if every single developer that is currently working on it, that is currently employed by the foundation, that is volunteering, if every single one of those people just disappeared off the face of the earth, there would still be the ability for new people to come in and maintain that momentum because there are so many people using it.
And I do want to add in there. So this fear of purchase and loss. I mean, it can be contained within one single word: Softimage. Softimage was an application. It was great. It's fantastic. I mean, I would say it is still fantastic, and people loved it. I loved playing with it. It was a great tool. It was the company that made Softimage was purchased by Autodesk, and eventually it's no longer. You can't work in Softimage now.
And ironically, had Softimage been open source, it would still be around today.
The other example where that fits is the whole concept of vendor lock-in, right? So, anybody who has an Adobe Cloud subscription and they want to open up, an InDesign file or an After Effects file, and their subscription has lapsed and therefore they can't run the application, they have no access to their own work.
No, and it becomes a real problem. And I do think it's interesting that so many people don't realize that the alternative to using an open source solution like Blender is a much riskier endeavor, particularly if you are staking your professional livelihood on it. If all of your work is behind proprietary software with proprietary file formats that you do not have the ability to open if your license expires, that is scary.
And it's not even just if your license expires, but what if that company goes out of business?
Case in point, there, one of the most recent acquisitions by Adobe is Figma. We have people on the team here at CG Cookie that use Figma every single day. And it's a big question of so what's going to happen? Do we need to replace this with a different tool? That suddenly has the ability to disrupt entire workflows with years of history, years of assets. And there is not a thing we can do about it other than to, either hope that it doesn't become a problem or change tools.
So in one big way, it's definitely protecting the artist. But as an artist, what are the restrictions that you have on the things that you create with Blender? Like with Unreal, for example, you can make and publish a game as long as you don't make up to a certain amount of money, and afterwards then you have to purchase it and whatnot. Does Blender have restrictions on what you do with what you make with it?
Simply put, everything you create in Blender is exclusively yours without exception, unless you choose to denote that otherwise. Regular good old copyright law comes into play, and the thing that you create is inherently yours. Unless the thing that you are creating is Blender code or Python code, and that's the thing that you are sharing. At which point, because it is using GPL license code and inheriting things from that, you have to create it as GPL or GPL compliant. Let's just say you're making a model and you're exporting that model to whatever format, you're sharing it wherever you want. You can release that model under any license you want. In the actual GPL text, it's considered the output of the program. And the output of a program is not dictated by the license of the source code of said program.
And with license law, anything that doesn't have a specific license is exclusively yours by default.
At least within the United States copyright law.
Anything that adheres to the Berne Convention. Different countries with their own copyright laws, they adopted what's called the Berne Convention, which basically is the second that you make something, you own the copyright to it. It is all rights reserved to you at that moment in time. The moment is fixed in some medium. So the second you make a model, the second you make a drawing, the second you make any kind of record any kind of music.
Adding the caveat that that's if you make it on your own time.
If you're doing this work for somebody else, then it was yours the moment it was created. And then if you did it under your company equipment with the company time, you have, depending on what agreement you have made in your contract, likely you have handed off the ownership of that, or at least licensed it into perpetuity throughout the universe.
Does that also apply to the things that are inherently not pieces of Blender, but have a lot of Blender in them? Like they can only be used in Blender. For example, if you make a geometry nodes node group that you can ship to other people, what about that?
I think geometry nodes actually is probably a really weird, great example because is it output of the program?
I think the way that is structured is that if it can exist in a world independent of Blender, like for instance, you make an image, there are many things that can show that image on a computer screen or print it on a piece of paper or whatever. So that's clearly output, and it doesn't require Blender to do anything further with it. However, geometry nodes don't work anywhere else except for Blender. But my understanding of it is that this is part of Blender. The very nature of it is that it is an open source license.
I didn't mean to pick a complicated example.
But it's a great example. Well, and I know that there have been instances of, quote unquote, copyright disputes or arguments that have been resolved, when it relates to things like presets. If you download somebody's render presets, what is the license on that? Is that by default royalty free? Is it GPL? I think the general answer is I would agree with Jason here that it's GPL. Because it doesn't exist outside of Blender as its own thing.
Presets could be...
They could be a JSON file.
Yeah, so if they're a JSON file or a text file that's human readable and that someone could manually put the values in on their own, that's probably safe as all rights reserved under your own thing, because it's just a bunch of text to describe a thing. But if you have a blend file...
Yeah, but blend files have been pretty well cleared up that a blend file is royalty free. It is not GPL. And in this case, a geometry node exists only within a blend file and cannot exist outside of that, at least not by default.
As far as I'm aware, I think anything that you make in Blender, even if it's a Blender thing, as long as it's not code that is actually changing Blender,
which of course you can include within a blend file.
So yeah, we're coming back full circle on this. This is worth coming. So the blend file itself is yours. That means the node group is yours. It only exists within Blender, but it is yours, and therefore that is under your copyright. That is not covered, as far as I can tell, by the GPL, unless we start to decide that a node network qualifies as a programming language.
It pretty much is.
Well, in the current form of geometry nodes, I don't believe that it's Turing complete. Therefore, it's not actually a programming language. You don't have You have some conditionals, but you don't really have loops, and you don't have a number of things that are sort of mainstays in a programming language to do those sort of things. So
I would have never thought about that.
you could probably make an argument that Houdini nodes in their current state are Turing complete and therefore qualify as a programming language.
Interesting. I mean, did you see the video a while ago of the guy who made an actual working mechanical computer inside of Houdini, just with all of the different switches and stuff? But it was like a 3D modeled computer that, like, as you zoomed out, actually worked. That is interesting, but I think it's really important that things in blend files are your own, because otherwise people at large companies, if they're working on a Disney show or whatever, that has to be theirs. That has to be, Disney's IP inside of this blend file.
Yeah.
Can't be open source. That doesn't make any sense.
Well, and there's also, because there is that caveat here, just with the way that Blender works and what's able to be included in a blend file is, for example, you can include a Python script in your blend file. But that also comes back to one of the key things of the GPL in general, which is you are not forced to release the thing that you make. You're not forced to share it. But if you share it, it has to be GPL.
Because it's based in copyright law, it's only triggered on distribution.
I think what makes text a little bit different, and we'll talk about add-ons specifically a little bit more later, is you're importing part of Blender in order to make it work. So you have the import BPY right at the top, because if it's just a text file, that can be yours. But if you import BPY, I think that's the dividing line.
Yeah.
I think we've pretty much covered that. There's not really any limits on what you can do. Well, there are some things that you can't do with Blender, but when you can do with Blender, anything that you would normally want to do as an artist, you're free to do with Blender. And using it in a workplace, using it wherever is pretty safe. Unless your work specifically says you can't use Blender, it's fair game, I believe.
Typically, in that scenario, it is a company saying you can't use open source because of the inference of license of saying, hey, if you use this thing in your program, you have to copy or continue the license. And there's a lot of people with a lot of proprietary software that they're using within a production pipeline that they do not want to release that way.
And they're not so much interested in thwarting people from using open source. They're worried about developing an open source and then therefore having to release whatever they develop within that open source ecosystem. Where things get to be fuzzy is what counts as distribution. If a company writes an add-on and they use it internally, they've never released it, technically. They've never distributed it. They're only using it internally, and therefore it's worked with their employees who already have their own sort of NDAs and other agreements and stuff like that. So it's all under one house, and therefore the GPL doesn't apply there because it's all used in-house. If that company has contractors, independent contractors, who have to use that add-on, all of a sudden, that's where it gets gray. Is that distribution? And depending on who you talk to, you could argue it either way.
And these are the types of topics that the big companies are all very worried about when it comes to open source. It's not something that most individuals, when they're creating work, even if creating work for hire, they don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about. Big companies think about it a lot. We ran into it recently with the work we're doing for Orange Turbine, just, with contract work and open source. And it gets complicated. Mostly it gets complicated because there's uncertainty. And lawyers don't like uncertainty in contracts.
They only like uncertainty that swings their direction. When you're dealing with companies that have a strong value on their intellectual property, on those kinds of things, the way that they interface with open source can outwardly look quite antagonistic. If you read the FBX license, it specifically calls out open source in a not too friendly way.
I definitely want to talk a little bit more about add-ons in just a second, but I also want to cover, is there anything else that you can't do with Blender? One thing that came to mind is you're not supposed to use their logo and their name without permission.
This is the difference between trademark licensing and copyright. Those things get very conflated, I think, in a lot of discussions. The simple thing is, well, the Blender Foundation owns the trademark. They own the logo and the name Blender. It is theirs to protect if they wish.
The way trademark law typically works is that if you do not enforce your trademark, you forfeit it. In some ways, trademark law incentivizes you to be a jerk, to say, hey, you can't use my name for that, because suddenly someone will use it and cause some sort of market confusion or whatever, and all of a sudden your brand no longer has the value it did.
What's that called when, something like a trademarked name gets so ingrained into the common language that the trademark is no longer enforceable, and so the courts just say, cool, nope, it's in the public domain now. What's that called? People think of, oh, I need a Kleenex. Well, it turns out Kleenex is just a brand of paper tissue.
Kleenex, Xerox. Actually, Adobe's still working on that with Photoshop. They do not like Photoshop as a verb.
I photoshopped that thing.
On some level, they don't mind because it's gaining the mind share. But at the same time, I photoshopped that in GIMP. No, they're not going to be cool with you saying that. The Blender trademark is owned by the Blender Foundation, and they get to control what gets to be called Blender. You can get permission to use their trademark. They don't have to go to everybody and say, you can't use this. You can say, you can use this under these terms or under these conditions, and sometimes those terms and conditions pay us money.
Jason recently wrote a blog post that was all about how to sell Blender add-ons without being a jerk. Can you give a quick summary of what that was about?
You'll see this not just on the Blender market, but you'll see this in people who are selling Gumroad or whatever other platform that they want to try and sell Blender add-ons. Like I was saying earlier, that misconception that it's their technology, their code that makes their product, their add-on special. There's value there, but there are also multiple people who thought, hey, it'd be great if I had this thing. You happen to be the person who made it, but more importantly, you're supporting it. You're not selling code. Even if you're selling proprietary software, you're not selling code.
Which for people that feel really attached to their code is a bit of it feels like a slap in the face, maybe. But like, no, I spent all this time writing that code. Damn right I'm selling it. Sorry, hate to break it to you, but you're really not. That's not the valuable thing.
Jason, you said a sentence there that I was kind of surprised by, that even in proprietary software, you're not selling the code.
The way that I phrase it in the blog post is you're selling the promise, right? You're selling the promise that you're going to be there, that you're going to support it, that you're going to be adding features when they're requested, you're going to be fixing things when people ask for things, when people discover things that are broken about it, because there are always things that are broken, that you're going to be explaining to people how to use the thing. What you're bringing to the table that's special that nobody else can do are all of those other things. And that's really what you're selling, right? There are examples of large companies and large proprietary tools that are like, every now and again, you're like, they're a horrible company to deal with, but I like their tool. That's the exception. That's not the rule. Most of the time, it's the other way around. It's like, yeah, you got a great tool. I don't want to work with you because you kind of suck as a person or as a company.
I mean, I think we can probably all find a few examples in our own lives, both in and out of software, where we continue to pay somebody because we just like working with them, because they're respectful to us, they're responsive, they help when we call, like, all of those things that go into providing a good service. That's how you earn repeat business. That's why people keep paying you. It's hard for people to accept that the value of the thing that you are selling is not what you spent most of your time up until that point doing. The value of the thing that you are selling is everything thenceforth. Admittedly, that's counter to, something like a model. A model is, if I have a scene that I'm working on and I need a specific type of car, I go buy that car. It's valuable in that moment and I'm done. I don't ask the creator of that car to make changes to it. No, I just buy it as is. That's not how software works. You don't buy software as is and then just hope it's going to work in perpetuity.
It has taken me a long time to wrap my mind around what it is that we're providing for people and separating it into what we're going to do in the future versus what we've already done in the past makes total sense to me.
If we look at the reason Blender Market came to be to begin with, was because that commitment, that promise to continue working on the thing wasn't happening. There'd be all these add-ons released, incredibly cool tools made, shared for free, which was amazing. And next thing you know, they're broken. What that results in is a broken ecosystem of add-ons where the only thing that you can truly rely on was vanilla Blender. And vanilla Blender was great. because it was maintained by the community and a dedicated group of people constantly working on that commitment to make it better. That's all an add-on is. You are committing to continue to make this thing better, and that's worth paying for.
You compared it to assets a little bit earlier and how it was different than a model of a car per se. A lot of add-ons now also have assets. What happens when those two are married together?
The GPL isn't really designed to and doesn't adequately cover things like models or stuff like that. Even for like creative works, other licenses are sort of better fits for that kind of media. Creative Commons ends up being one of those. Royalty free is another one of those. These are all rights reserved. Also, it gets included with that. And so the solution for that sort of thing is you have a product that you're selling. It's bundled in this nice little zip file or however you're distributing it. With that, you should have a file in there that says license that describes the different, if it's all under one license, say it's all under that one license. If it's multiple license, you say, all right, stuff that's in this folder is under this license, go there to read it. Stuff that's in this folder is under this license, go there to read that. These are the terms, this is Jason's own personal terms and conditions license. And then this is the add-on that I've written to reference all of these assets. This is all GPL.
It's worth mentioning probably that with dual licensing, this is not a practice that's very well facilitated by any of the platforms, regardless of how you choose to distribute your add-on, your assets, your asset pack with an add-on interface, whatever it is. This is definitely an area that needs to be improved, I think, just as a whole within the community.
If you're looking on Blender Market for any given product, only one license currently, as far as I know, can be listed. And really, from a user interface standpoint, how do you say this part of my product is licensed thusly, and this part of the product, it's a user interface nightmare of trying and figure out the best way to do that. And I look forward to the Blender Market folks figuring that part of it out. But in the meantime, your canonical place to look is in the actual zip file or whatever it's being distributed with.
Speaking of being complicated, did you guys read about the Google versus Oracle debate that happened last year, or maybe it was the year before?
I'm fuzzy on the exact details other than that it's been ongoing for a while.
Oracle bought IP. Specifically, they bought the IP to Java. That was previously owned by Sun, I believe, Sun Microsystems. They were, I'll say, open source leaning with Java, but they weren't full on open source with it as a language. Google used some of the default libraries and things that are in Java as part of their Android development. And Oracle basically says, you're using our API, therefore the API is copyrightable, and that's our interface, therefore it is subject to our copyright, therefore it has to be under the terms of our license, therefore Google, you owe Oracle money. It was really interesting to follow because everybody hates Oracle. At least in the open source community, I don't know of anybody who actually really likes Oracle as a company. With Google winning that, all of a sudden the GPL doesn't have the ability to have that viral part of it. But then, oh no, that means that Java is not as open as it was, and Oracle wins, and nobody likes Oracle. And well, nobody actually really likes Google anymore either. But I found myself unable to root for one side or the other, and just like, what in the world is this going to shake out for me at the end of the day, and trying to figure out how all this stuff works.
I felt exactly the same way because it seemed like good positives on either end of the result. Whereas if we have it such that it's fair use to use an API, and so it's not copyrightable to, you can't say that just because you imported BPY into a script, therefore it's, importing Blender and all of that. Then you could have a Substance plugin years before it was made, or a Houdini plugin that is probably never going to happen, but Houdini can run in Unreal and run in Unity just fine, but it can't run in Blender only because of the copyright. There's also downsides of suddenly add-ons not having to be open source.
The outcome of Google versus Oracle is going to set a new precedent, and we just don't know what that precedent is yet.
And really, I mean, what it comes down to also, I think for me, is what's the spirit of it? You'll talk to people who are not big fans of the GPL, and for the last decade, you'll hear them say the GPL has never been tested in court, so you don't know whether or not it actually holds up. True, but we're also looking at what's the spirit of the license? What's it trying to say? I mean, technically, the Blender market doesn't necessarily have to read the same interpretation of the GPL that the Blender Foundation and the Free Software Foundation do. But if you're already thinking, I'm not selling code, I'm selling all of this other stuff that is actually more valuable, I think that's a better mindset to be in anyway. So whether or not ultimately it shakes out, the technicality of whether or not an API is copyrightable and those parts of it, the spirit of all of this is what we're adhering to. And that's I think, until we're told to do otherwise, that's probably the best thing to do.
I think that leads perfectly into the final thing that I wanted to talk about as well, and that's piracy when it comes to Blender add-ons.
This is my favorite topic.
You love talking about this.
I do love talking about it, and I'm salty about it.
Why is that? Why are you salty?
So, for one, as the founder of the Blender market and still being very heavily involved in the Blender market day to day, working with a lot of creators to help people make products be their very best, but also in dealing with problems when they arise, there is a constant tug of war between people making and selling add-ons and the perceived slights of people getting those add-ons in non-official ways. If you sell an add-on through the Blender market and then somebody else downloads that add-on and shares it on a third-party site, it feels crappy. But this all goes back to, what are you actually selling? You are selling a promise, a commitment to continue to support that thing, to provide bug fixes, to improve it, to make your customer's life better. Because here's the thing. People don't buy a piece of software and then go off to an abandoned island and never talk to anybody again about that software. They ask for help. They have bug reports. They have problems. They need assistance. They have wishes. They want this software to do more things, to do that thing and that thing, so that they can, again, do more of what they're trying to do faster and more easily. And that only works if you allow the customer to get it easily and you give them that commitment. Now, none of that, by the way, has anything to do with piracy. But the reason that I'm salty when it comes to DRM and piracy is that, in my opinion, it is a waste of your time to try to combat that. An absolute waste of your time to put time, energy, and in some cases money into systems that try to prevent people from sharing, in your view, illicitly. It's not going to happen. It's a game of whack-a-mole. Piracy has been happening online since the early days of the internet. And you know what? Still to this date, not a single person has solved it. So instead, focus your time on the things that you can actually be productive about. The things that actually can, impact your livelihood in a positive way, not just be a time sink. If you want to have the most valuable impact on the work that you do and your livelihood, piracy is not the problem.
And I'm actually glad you said that. I mean, because the counter argument, if with what you led into with, it's not, let's presuppose we're talking about, what we're selling is the promise, is that dedication. Well, you'll hear people say, well, yeah, that means that somebody who got my product now is getting support from me, and they didn't pay me for that support. The effort that it takes to say no and then figure out why you said no and then try to validate all that. You could have said yes, made a friend, and maybe made a customer.
If they're having an issue, it's not just them who's having the issue. And what are we going to say? No, we're not going to fix a bug.
Trust is one of those things that is hard won and it's very easily lost. And if you lose that trust of a customer, of an individual, of a whole community, there's not a lot you can do to regain that trust if you've been seen to abuse it. This is something that we talk about a lot with a lot of creators on Blender Market and on other platforms, is basically playing defense. In this case, DRM, anti-piracy measures. Well, I want to do all these things because I think that my product might be getting stolen or shared. Even if you disagree with the fundamental premise of is it worth doing, you should still take the time to evaluate how much time, if you do this, are you expending to try to combat this issue.
Because a lot of people who are doing this, like, I want to stop people from stealing my stuff. Laudable goal. Okay, so you tracked down somebody who stole your stuff. What do you do then? You have more time that you have to spend trying to litigate or, stop this person from stop doing bad things on the internet. I mean, lawyers ain't cheap.
Yeah, not only does it take all of that time, but it's also actively making it inconvenient for the users that you do have who are actually paying you.
If you spend half of your time combating illicit sharing, that's half of your time that you are not investing into gaining new customers, to helping your existing customers. And there's one thing that I think is always true in business, and that is it is much easier to get an existing customer to spend more money with you than it is to earn a new customer outright. And the moment that you are just fighting piracy instead of helping your existing customers, you are not doing right by them.
So I wrote a book. I also used to teach sort of institutionally in game design and those sort of things. And one of my students came up to me and said, "Hey, I know you wrote a book." And he's like, and I was like, yeah, I did. He's like, cool. I pirated your book. And I'm like, all right, well, thanks for letting me know that. No, he said, here's $10 from a teacher-student ethical thing. I'm not sure how that worked, but as an author's reader thing, I'm fine with it. But the funny thing is that based on the price of the book and the royalties that I get for that book, that was almost 10 times more than I would have gotten from the sale of that book.
We spend a lot of time passing judgment, even if inadvertently, on the actors that are sharing these things through non-direct means, through, what most people would call piracy. But you've got to ask the question, what about all the people that then get it through that? And Dylan, what happens to their interest in the thing that they just got? And I think, Jason, your story is perfect because a lot of people, and I guarantee you every person in this chat room is guilty of this in our past selves, maybe current selves, have pirated something before. And how many of those have you then discovered, like, oh, I actually really like this thing. I'm now far more interested in this thing that I got, even if through illicit means, and now I'm more interested in supporting it. Because you know what happens when I support it? I actually get updates. I get access to the resources to learn how to use it. I get to ask the questions directly of the person that created it. I get to learn more about it, and I get to do more cool things. There is a huge number of people that become users of a software or customers of a creator, even if they started without being a customer to begin with. What is one of the single most valuable things that you can do as an independent creator? And that is to grow your audience. That audience size is about the most valuable thing you've got. It's not copies of an add-on sold. It's not individual licenses activated. It's not any of that. It's how many people do you have actively exchanging their money for your time? And when you grow that audience, you tend to do better.
Most situations and most media production things, whether you're making movies, books, video games, any of the output sort of things, you're not fighting piracy. You're fighting just discoverability. You're fighting to be heard at all. The fact that you get pirated should be a compliment because somebody actually heard your name. We're spoiled a bit in the Blender community because you don't have to fight for air nearly as much as you have to do in other media.
Although you have to fight more for it now than you used to.
That's true.
Just the nature of it growing dramatically.
And it's only going to grow more. And so again, your problem isn't going to be piracy. Your problem is going to be discoverability.
Pick any add-on on the Blender market and now remove Blender from the equation and release it as a standalone software with no built-in audience, and then try to make that successful.
I like how we started out talking about sharing things, and then at the end we just ended up talking about the community and sharing things. I feel like that came full circle. That was nice. Any last things that you guys would want to talk about when it comes to, I mean, probably not license law, but I don't know, open source or GPL?
even though it's very easy to get lost in the weeds of licensing and to feel like you're constantly just fighting the GPL or that it's too restrictive or things like that, at the end of the day, the GPL and open source licensing in general, and what we were just talking about with piracy and DRM and sharing, the thing that it enables more than anything else, and what makes it so valuable and so powerful, both as developers, as artists, as add-on creators, as businesses, as individuals, is the ability to share those things that you create with such a wide audience freely, and to have the freedom to share other things that other people have created, and to let those things, bounce off of one another, and to, be greater than the sum of its parts. That doesn't happen in proprietary ecosystems. And the fact that we're able to do this, the fact that all of us are able to work around Blender, in Blender, on Blender, etc., that exists because it's open source. And all the things that are related to it, all the businesses that have sprung up, all the individual artists, that exists because Blender's open source. And, I would challenge you to find any other community for any other software, be it 3D animation or not, that is proprietary, that even comes close to matching the size and the intensity in a good way, the intensity of the Blender community. I don't think it exists.
No. And I think it's also, I just had it. I lost it. It was so good. But it's those benefits, right? You anytime you look at what's going on and have questions about the GPL and feeling that bit of restriction, stop and ask yourself, if it's so bad, how come every closed company out there is trying to illustrate to their audience the ways that they are open in some form? The attractiveness of openness, even if they're not actually doing it, they want to be able to say that they're doing it. Because there's value there, both in name and actual real value. And because Blender is GPL, and because of the licensing that they chose when they made it free, we don't have to act. We have the real deal.
Man, well said. Well, thank you guys so much for taking the time to talk today. I'm honored to work with both of you, and I hope we can have you on more episodes soon. And thank you, dear listener, for tuning in to this conversation. I know that navigating the GPL and licensing can sometimes be confusing. So if you use Blender professionally and have any questions about Blender's license and how it affects your business, or how to integrate Blender into your existing pipeline in a way that fits your needs, feel free to reach out to Jason, Jay, and myself at orangeturbine.com. We're a pretty new consulting company, but have already worked with Adobe, Roblox, and a variety of clients who all want to utilize the power of Blender. To see and share the best clips of this episode, subscribe to the CG Cookie YouTube channel. And as always, leaving a review for the podcast would be much appreciated. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you in the next episode.